welcome back to the Most Modern Podcast, where we establish convening power in the built environment. Today, I'm once again joined by my co-hosts Minggu Kang and Ligo Lee, as well as a very special guest joining us today from New York. We have with us Evan Wiskup. As you all know, right now we're in this initial season, we're holding conversations about careers that shape our physical environment and the space around us. And Evan brings us a very unique perspective, both from that of an architect, but as well as someone who's gone into real estate development and also wears that hat. Evan is the founder of Wiskup Architecture. He's also the co-founder of Neighbor, a real estate and architecture outfit that combines design and development in one practice. Previously, Evan worked as a project manager at Alloy in Brooklyn, as well as practicing architecture in the New York offices of OMA, as well as the Berkeley Ingalls Group, BIG. So welcome, Evan, to Most Modern.
Great intro. What's up?
How's it going?
It's great. It's a little chilly here in New York, but everything's great.
Yeah, I understand you just got back from your honeymoon, so congratulations on that, and thanks for making this one of your first stops back from the tropics.
Yeah, I literally just got the plane right now, and now we're here, so I know I've been back for a while.
Well, hopefully you've got some fresh ideas and then a lot to share with us. So I'm just going to start from the top. I mentioned that you're both an architect and a developer, but I know you started in architecture. So I kind of wanted to know initially, before you studied architecture, before you became a formal kind of pursuit, what was it that drew you to design?
Nothing in particular, to be honest with you. I wasn't good at drawing or like arts as a kid, but I wasn't also like good at math or science. Like I was kind of pretty in the middle of everything in most things I did. But then I had a chance to like visit an architect's office one day as a kid. I just got lucky, honestly. And it was awesome. And it was kind of like, oh, this exists. And like, this is a thing. And people do it like this. And it's creative, but it's like, mathy. And at the same time, like, it kind of, it really resonated with me. And that was my first exposure. It was just like looking at what a design studio looks like. This is kind of amazing. That prompted me. I think like people do like the whole Legos thing, and like that wasn't part of my childhood too, but that, right?
You're an outlier in that. I think most of our guests have also mentioned Legos, but I guess you said that wasn't not your stick. But so in high school, I guess you had to decide what you wanted to do, and did you decide you wanted to apply to architecture school at that point? Did I see that?
Yeah, and I didn't know like what that meant really, and I just like knew what it visually looked like, and I grew up in the suburbs in Florida, and so I didn't have a lot of exposure to what I would call design excellence, but I just knew something was out there, and so it seemed interesting to me, and so I wanted to give it a shot, but I wasn't like totally married to it. Like I wasn't like a diehard until I really got to architecture school and started to like understand what it meant to be an architect.
So you end up at WashU, St. Louis, and I guess what was that transition point for you when you started to kind of understand what the whole vibe, the whole culture, the whole pursuit was like?
Yeah, WashU's an interesting place because it's kind of like just on the threshold of being within the city of St. Louis. And growing up where I grew up, being able to go there and experience a whole set of different urban issues that have impacted the city ever since it was founded was very, very impactful as someone wanting to be an architect one day. Because there's challenges that city faces that the city encourages students to address through their work, through the way they're thinking about the city. And part of that's just like your own personal exploration, living in a new place, but also like the city, the school really does stress like addressing real socioeconomic issues that are built into the environment in St. Louis. So it was very impactful to me as an architect or young architect at the time, because I didn't realize the agency that architects could have on those sorts of things. My take on it going into architecture school was like, oh, we'll make pretty things. And that's fun. Like we make pretty things. We'll make towers. Right? That's kind of like what you think about as a kid. Like when you're like gonna be an architect, and it's like just make towers. But then you start to learn that architecture is much more than that, and that the scale of things, even on the smallest scale, can make a really meaningful impact on people's lives and hopefully improve it. And that was a really great kind of awakening I had there. And I think most people that go through that program have a similar experience.
Yeah, there's quite a few schools that advertise themselves as using their host city as a sort of laboratory, and it seems like that was the case at WashU. I know for me, and I think Lebo and maybe Miko as well, we also were influenced by the places we were in, like Houston in particular for me and Lebo, and constantly having to engage with that context, which is always changing and also shifting, but then realizing that your work then does have an influence on that context and that has agency there.
Yeah, and that people, if you put an idea forward, even in an academic setting, people are interested in it and people want to engage in it and talk about it and think about it positively. And like, as a student, you actually have a pretty significant voice that kind of quickly goes away once you start your career, at least your individual voice. And so there's a lot of agency there that's pretty awesome.
What were you into back then?
Like personally? Or like,
Yeah, personally, architecture-wise, design-wise.
yeah, it's funny. I like, one of the things I did most in St. Louis was bike. Like I got really into like biking around the city. It wasn't like long distance biking. It was more like biking to like interesting, cool neighborhoods. Like there's a lot of historical neighborhoods in St. Louis that there was like a gang of folks that we used to bike around and like go to a restaurant somewhere, go to a bar somewhere, like go to something going on in the city. And there's a really interesting culture around that. And the architecture school is kind of just on the outskirts of the school, and so we were able to just like hop on our bike and like go downtown. And so I remember a lot of the times we would go to the Arch in St. Louis, which is just an amazing building because it really is a building. It's 7 miles away from the architecture school, and like we kind of always raced down there. That was always kind of the fun part. There's a few different ways to get there from the architecture school, and I don't know, it's just an amazing like physical experience to kind of transport yourself across different neighborhoods. And so that was a big part of it. Music was also a huge interest of mine at the time. I mean, we were like, I think the 4 of us here were in college during like a really interesting time, like an indie music perspective. And so there's a lot of interesting things that always came through St. Louis. But otherwise, like honestly, I was pretty dedicated to architecture. That consumed me.
Any memorable professors or courses?
Yeah, there's a really cool course. I think it's still taught at WashU by a professor named Derek Hefferlin, and he typically brings students down to New Orleans, which is pretty close to St. Louis. I mean, it's a drive, but it's pretty close. And we really delve into the issues of stormwater management and water, like living next to water, essentially, and using the example of New Orleans and the challenges that it faces and applying that to other areas of the world. So it was a really interesting studio, but they also engaged physical issues and engineering issues that I just like didn't really think of before then. You start to think of cities like Amsterdam, or you think of cities in Asia that deal with water in a much different way. And that's kind of made New Orleans a really special place for me because it is unique in the country in that regard. And so that was a good one for me. Yeah, that was probably one that I think of the most.
Nice. And so after WashU, you end up at grad school in Yale in New Haven. Was it a pretty smooth transition, or did you find that it was a totally different environment?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like if WashU is a school, maybe like similar to Rice, Houston, like we were kind of looking out into the world, thinking about how to engage with the surroundings as an architect. Yale is, I kind of felt it was a little different. It was more inward looking in the discipline, in the profession, in the dogma of architecture, capital A architecture. So there was, definitely folks that were interested in New Haven as a place, but it didn't like really permeate through the school in the same way that the culture of WashU had. And so I was really faced with a lot of new ideas about capital A theory of architecture at Yale that I hadn't really ever engaged in before. And that really started like with theorizement at Yale. And most people you talk to that went to Yale kind of in my same years mention that. It's a pretty intensive experience working in Eisman's classes, and I ended up taking quite a few in his studio at Yale, and it really changes the way you think about architecture and space, I think, on almost a fundamental level that I hadn't really ever thought about. I really left undergrad thinking that phenomenology was kind of like how most finding the right piece of wood that had the most beautiful green in it, or the shadow that was cast in the most beautiful way, and how good you could assemble a watercolor image. And I actually was never that good at any of that. And so I always felt a little disconnected from architecture. And then I was like, I got exposed to like Greg Lynn and formalism and like Renaissance architecture through the formalist lens. And I was like, oh, this is actually something I can connect with, because it's a little bit more analytical than understanding how light's hitting a material, or like the touchy feelingness of certain objects, which is something I still really enjoy. But it exposed me to the more kind of theoretical side of architecture that really drove, honestly, like how I set forth the rest of my career, how I set forth my path at Yale.
Well, I think that's a good transition into once you graduate. Actually, that's when you and I met, when we started working at OMA together. What was it then that you're looking for in a career after both your experience at WashU as well as the new things and the new worlds that you had experienced on Yale?
Yeah, I mean, because I was so involved with the formalism as defined by the Eisenman way of thinking, I wanted to shift a little bit towards what I consider the opposite in the way that we practice today, and that's through the cultural projects that I think like Rem is probably the biggest champion of. And so I wanted to shift gears to OMA, knowing that there's a little bit more out there. And obviously there's a ton of other ways to practice. But I found that to be like a really more educational than anything move, to see how the office practiced. The intensity of it is obviously important to understand, but really the theoretical framework that the cultural projects of OMA works internally. Because I actually think it's a little hard to, from in a school setting, to engage that material in the same way that theoretical information can be conveyed to students. And so that was really the driver to my move.
Was OMA your first job out of college and grad school?
Yeah, I'd done little internships here and there, but that was my first like full time.
Can you maybe just build on slightly on what you just said in terms of not being able to engage quite exactly with the cultural project in school? I mean, we often talk about how school is an approximation of the building process that it's always kind of reduced to 3.5-month semesters, and so a lot of times on the technical side, you just can't do the same thing, can't build a building or design a building in the same way that you would in the real world, just because of the limitation of time. But it seems like there's other factors too that are limiting what you might actually be able to do from maybe a more social conscious perspective or cultural perspective too. Is it the influence of the market or the influence of just change that happens in practice that doesn't happen in academia?
I think in academia, which I love, there's a culture of rightness that everyone will inevitably land on something correct. And that's based on the assumption that the work that you're going to be doing is properly, the foundations of the work are going to lead you to that inevitable correct solution. Project, why I'm calling it that, is it almost requires more upfront work, I guess, in the academic setting, to be done by like a professor, for instance. That isn't, it's more complex than, I think, more hot button cultural words. The project of OMA is, it's founded in 40 plus years of very intensive critical thought, and it's kind of always building upon that. The nature of the architectural studio or school is typically like, well, you're starting a new class, so we're starting brand new, and like, we're just gonna do it. And it's like, and instead, when you work in an office with the foundations, like any major office that's been around for a while, there's a language to the work, but there's also a way of thinking that you can't really be like a tourist in, I would say. Like, you can't really, like it's all dance studios. It's funny, I remember seeing like you go to an advanced student, everyone kind of like their renderings look like that person's renderings all of a sudden, and their models look like that person's models all of a sudden. It's like you feel this responsibility to emulate the stylistic leanings of the teacher, but it's very superficial at the end of the day in my mind, and that's okay. That's an important part of your education, is to like kind of flex those different design muscles when it comes to representation. But when it comes to OMA, I think it challenges your thoughts in a way that maybe what you're doing will never be right, actually. And like that inevitability of being right, and being able to develop the project further, to like a final presentation or whatever, may never happen, because maybe you're just not going to find a right solution to the problem you're seeking. Does that make sense? I mean, you're nodding a bit. Am I saying it the right way?
Yeah, totally.
Well, I guess the question then becomes, did you find what you wanted when you went there? Um,
OMA?
what did you discover? Yeah, at OMA or eventually at Big.
Working age.
Yeah, I mean, the two firms work somewhat similarly, somewhat. Yeah, I mean, like the openness of the design environment and the egalitarian approach towards design problems is important, and those are two wonderful places. I think that practice that kind of intellectual rigor at all levels. So yes, there is something really important to be taken from those places. I think thinking about my own career in the way that they practice, from just a perspective of like, maybe we do things one way, and there's conventions to building and architecture, but maybe that's not necessarily the right way to do it for any given project. And I think that openness to think about design problems through a fresh set of eyes is really important. And I think that that's kind of how I think about business as well, and the way that I practice. And so I think that constant kind of like, what are we doing right now? Or why are we doing this? Or not feeling like anything is too precious and not being attached to anything, without like properly vetting it, I think is really important. And there's an attitude, particularly at OMA, that nothing is really precious. Like, you could really work on something for quite some time. And so you can shift gears pretty quickly there, because something more interesting or better emerges out of the design process. And I think that not being so tied to anything, really from a design perspective, is really important. And I think that goes for most things creative.
Well, you could have kept going. You could have stayed on working as an architect there, but you sort of decided to take a different approach, or at least come at things a little bit tangentially. You started looking at real estate development, and I'm curious how that kind of impulse started, and then what you did to move forward with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I never thought of like one is like development, the other is architecture. The distinction for me has always been a little strange. I would say overly academic, and what prompted it was like really I thought about the architects I liked, really going back in time to the beginning of architecture, and really went back to like Renaissance architects and thinking about how they practiced. And there was a level of involvement that Renaissance architects and really early practitioners had in architecture. And I'm not talking about agency. I'm really talking about the ability to execute design ideas at a high level, while testing them against the financial and construction feasibility of a project. That's kind of what I'm talking about. That was really in the hands of what most people would consider like an architect, in quotation marks, for quite some time. And that role has only degraded significantly in the past 60 to 80 years in architecture. And that's due to a lot of different factors. But as I was thinking about what the rest of my life would look like as an architect, I felt like I was only going to track along the degradation of the role of the architect. And that by the time I was at the end of my career, whatever that may be, I would look back and think, oh, well, like, this isn't kind of what I wanted to do. Like, this isn't why I got into this in the first place. Like, I was inspired by the creative nature of it and the ability to, like, actually build buildings in a way that I wanted to be involved in. And so that prompted me to think about, well, how do I expand this role? And what I want to do. And what does that look like in conventional terms. And again, it's like it's a conventional term, working in real estate development, and I think it's a term that we use to make it legible to the rest of the world what we do. But I think it's always a challenge to kind of put yourself in those boxes, because that's one of the problems that architects have created for themselves.
Oh, that's a very interesting perspective that I also relate to. So I guess you also had some sort of a longing towards the master builder, the master architect type, where they had more creative control, more control over creative projects, actual properties that they built from potentially start to finish. So you had a client and an architect relationship that it gave the architect the ability to build and realize the things that he imagined. But then when humanity progressed, everything got compartmentalized, specialized, and then also the regulations around the building code, zoning codes, they are the amount of regulations itself, I think it's incomparable. When the architects had to deal in the Renaissance, and when we see the things that we have to deal to build something now, then
Even like just in the past 10 years with all the regulations for good reason for things like sustainability, accessibility, it's just so much more complicated and onerous than it ever was before. So you do have to
yeah,
find a way to actually get around that sometimes in order to, like you're saying, Evan, to kind of make the most of your opportunity in your career.
Yeah, and building codes are good, and like they save lives. Like that's the most important thing. And buildings are safer today than they ever have been before, and that's a wonderful thing. Because for a long time, the history of humans, you could perish in a fire in a building very easily, or you could drink something, out of unfiltered water and get a disease that would kill you. And there's like really great benefits to this. But on the flip side, yeah, you're right. There is like a prohibitive nature of construction industry today that is maybe more of a challenge that kind of hinders our ability to make things. And a good example of that is like I was just traveling through Southeast Asia, and it has some of the more interesting modern architecture examples of modern architecture I've ever seen, because there's little to no building code there, as far as I can tell. The people that I talk to, I could be wrong, probably am. But certain areas, especially smaller areas, smaller towns that I went to, like we were driving around, I was like, wow, that's like a really cool building, or that's really interesting, or if like that was somewhere in the United States, like that would really catch a lot of attention. So I think when it comes to like the experimental nature of architecture, there is a challenge that we face when it comes to that. But I don't think it's a bad thing because buildings are so safe.
but I mean the code is one thing, but then I mean you gave an example of U.S. buildings and Southeast Asia or Asian buildings where maybe the regulations are a little lax, but also the process of like community engagement. I think Asia is a little limited on that aspect, which gives more freedom to the architect or the owner to build what he imagines that he can afford that fits within their own zoning code. But here, I mean, I deal with that almost daily when you present the project to the community. You get some random comments that you have never thought of based on your extensive experience as a designer or during the education. You never thought of things that, oh, why is this building using different material than the one next to it, or I think things like that.
That's my favorite part. That's my favorite part, because yeah, like the many times it's questions that you would never ask as yourself as an architect or real estate developer or whatever, because you're like your head is in a different place. That's one of the wonderful things about what we do, is everyone can engage in the work and everyone can be a critic. And I think that's an amazing thing about building buildings. And so that the community engagement component of building is one of the things I cherish the most in the process.
Well, now that you're talking about sort of what you do, you mind explaining to us what you are doing kind of day to day now? So you worked at Alloy for a bit, and I guess Alloy is known for being a designer developer, and then you struck out on your own. So you have Wiskup Architecture. You also have Neighbor. Can you tell us a bit about those enterprises and maybe what differentiates them?
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I started a development in architecture practice called Neighbor with my co-founder Brian, and we really started to take on large projects had a very long timeline. It's typically you do as a real estate developer with many different challenges, entitlement challenges, construction challenges, financial challenges, like everything that you typically encounter in the development process. And that's wonderful work. And it's something that we really enjoy doing. And we work all over the country, obviously based in New York. And so we started that 2 years ago. But it's funny, as that was happening, and as I was leaving my full-time job to start my own practice, I was thinking a lot about what I kind of missed after like really moving into the development world full-time. And it took a lot of soul searching and reflection to realize like I actually do want to wear the architecture hat solely at times. And I want to be able to engage in many projects simultaneously in different phases and not be involved on the entire development scope of work for everything. And so that took a lot of creativity professionally to figure out how that would work, just from a, obviously day-to-day standpoint, but also organizationally that was set up. But for me, that's kind of created like what I call like a two-headed monster. There's like an architecture development way to do it, and then there's like architecture development on it. And they overlap all the time, but many times they're separate. And that's something that I've wanted personally, and something I've enjoyed. And the what it came down to for me as I make a lot of the career decisions that I've made, starting from school, it kind of goes back to the beginning of this conversation, is like trying to reduce decision making down in my career to really simple terms. And the simplest term that I could think of when I was trying to design what my solo practice life would look like is what would make me happy on a day-to-day basis. And it's like really that simple. It's like you can't count on every day being happy with what you're doing. There's going to be plenty of things that aren't going to be amazing to be working on, but overall it should be pretty damn good what you feel like you're doing. And if it's not, that's okay, but it's worth reflecting and thinking about things and trying to come up with a creative solution to find a way to look back on what you're doing every day and say, oh yeah, this is awesome. And like, I'm really happy with this work. And this is really amazing to be doing. And so it took a lot of reflection to realize that that was like a really meaningful path for me to take. But that's not to say that it might change in the future. And I think it would be a mistake to think like, oh, like, this is what it is. And like me a couple of years ago decided this is like happiness path. It goes back to a lot of career decisions, I think, where like kind of constantly have to reevaluate the position with whatever makes sense for you. So I learned a really good technique. I forget where I found this from, but at the end of every day, what I've tried to do is rank every day between a scale of -2 to 2. -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. And you start making lists of all your days, and then you add it up, and you should really be positive. Like, you're going to have -2 days, you're going to have -1 days. Like, that's life, that's okay. But like, if all of your days are -2, from a just emotional standpoint, you need to shift. And that could mean professionally, it could mean personally, it could mean just changing habits, whatever it is. I think that's important. And so I want to be really straightforward and honest. That's kind of what has driven me in a lot of the things that I've done, is reflecting on those different, just kind of like basic levels of happiness,
Yeah, that's very admirable. And I also relate to that because, when I started my own a few months ago, and
nice.
really all it matters is your happiness, basically, because you're the one who needs to put in the work, put in the time to do the work. And if you're in a crappy mood, I'm seeing that the work itself gets also crappy. Like I also react to things more negatively, or or just react to things that I could have just overcame easily, but because I'm in a bad mood, you get a little how can you say? You overreact to things, that's just, not that important. So yeah, I think
all the
yeah,
time.
that's
And you're like, what the hell was I arguing about? Like a doorknob? Like, or like, what was
yeah,
I like frustrated about? Like some person's email about flooring finish? Like
yeah.
it becomes like that insane. And so I don't think this talked enough. I don't think this is talked about enough in what we do as professionals. I think it's talked about in plenty of other industries, just it hasn't come through to the built industry and architecture for some reason. Because we're supposed to be stoic. We're supposed to be artists. We're supposed to be reactionary, right? Like we're distant, like we're distant from reality. Like that's okay. Like, you know, we have a voyeuristic look, and that's not fair. Like that's not a fair attitude. And yeah, I blame professional a little bit. I blame schooling a little bit. But I also think architecture attracts certain personalities that like to not emulate.
It's definitely a personality type. I always thought it'd be really interesting to do a sort of psychoanalysis large scale on the architecture and just the design disciplines in general. But I might be generalizing quite a bit. But I know what you mean. I mean, there's a certain type of person who is willing to work long hours and really focus on things.
Yeah, I think it's also related to the seeking of perfectness. Like you want to perfect everything, like every corner of your diagram or rendering or plan or whatever you're producing, you want to perfect it. So it's difficult to be always perfect.
Yeah,
And
you
it
know what?
stresses you out.
Good point. And like I've been around a decent number of well-regarded architects at this point in my life, and I can tell you that's not something that they're thinking about. Like I think most good architects, however you define it, are concerned about being like 70 to 80% perfect.
Mm.
And maybe less than that, maybe 60. It's more important to like make sure you do things on time and get something constructed and do it properly and deliver materials properly. And concern about perfection is almost setting yourself up for an impossible task that will hurt you at the end of the day. You will hurt yourself because Peter Zumthor is 101, guys. Like we're not touching Peter Zumthor. Like if we could all be half as good as him, like that would be amazing.
But the question is also, would you want to be him? I mean, I personally, don't want to live in a mountain village in Switzerland and live a hermetic lifestyle like that. Like, I just don't, right? And so to idolize that sort of behavior, I don't think is the same as idolizing his work. They're completely, I mean, they're connected, but one comes with the other potentially. And I think that there's a lot of kind of God worshipping that occurs relatively early on in architecture careers. That I think if it lasts too long, then it's just not very helpful.
For sure. And it's exciting when you're in architecture school and like a famous architect comes for a lecture and you see them and you're like, wow, this is so cool. Like this is amazing. And you get all wrapped up in it. And over time, I think that fades. And that's okay. I think working for some of those folks helps, but you don't have to.
Yeah. But I
Maybe
also
living
don't
in the
want
mountains making what makes Peter Zumthor happy.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
That
Exactly.
doesn't
But I think
mean
another thing
make
is
us
like,
happy.
but I think it's interesting, right? Like I feel like, so far we've met quite a few different versions of Evan the architect, like the academic, the capital A designer, the developer. Like now that you're striking out on your own and you're doing what makes you happy, I guess like what is the current version of Evan the architect?
Yeah, I mean, the current version is managing a lot of projects, working on a handful of development projects, and trying to stay stimulated, growing both businesses at the same time. There's an interesting design problem that comes with building a business that isn't, it's just as interesting, but in a lot of ways, it's as interesting as designing a building that I'm really focused on. And there's only one of me, to your point. And so it's about, using my time efficiently and trying to make wonderful things that improve the world at the same time.
Can you give us some insight into the types of projects that you're working on, or the type of work that you currently do? Because what we were doing at OMA 10 years ago is not what we're doing right now, for sure.
Yeah. So on the development side, we're doing a handful of projects in and around New York City. One of the more interesting things also that we've been working on really in the past year and a half, call it, since development has become more stagnated due to rising interest rates, is strengthening the advisory component of our company, which kind of deals with our ability to wear many hats through the development process, and that deals with both architecture and development. So it's like development on the architecture side of things. Wiskup Architecture. Wiskup Architecture really focuses closely around New York and a little bit in Florida. Ground up construction on Long Island and in the Catskills, and mostly interiors, but some extensions, renovations, and ground up in the city of New York. So yeah, it's like a full plate for sure of stuff between the two companies.
Do you have a vision for where you want it to go in terms of size, in terms of location or influence?
Yeah, I mean, for both, growing a design studio based in design excellence is important. And so I think architecture is a collaborative effort. And so one of the things that we're focused on in both companies is growing them into like actually proficient design studios, that's happening currently. And a focus on construction of very few things of a very high quality. Like that's also like an important tenet. There's an attitude with some architects which is like just do as much as possible, and it's all about quantity. And what we find ourselves doing, a lot of our work is actually saying no to a lot of projects, no to a lot of opportunities, because we try to be really selective with the folks that we work with our partners, and also how we use our time. So that's pretty critical for us in the way that we just think about things. And it goes back to happiness again. It's like, maybe we might do an intense work week, however you define that, 1 week, but that can't be your whole life, because those of us who worked in offices where that's the status quo know that that's an unsustainable way to practice this. And so we're really mindful of that, and know that for architecture especially, being outside of the office and being in the world is just as important as being in the office and doing the work, because that's how you really become inspired and understand the built environment. So that's a major focus too. And it's like just being efficient.
What's the selection criteria you mentioned that you are, picking and choosing the projects that comes to you? Like, what do you care the most?
Yeah, so a few things. The most important thing is always who we're partnering with or who we're working with on any project. And so we find that in those initial conversations where we're just kind of like feeling each other out, it's there is a real emotional component where when we're talking about a project with a potential partner, it's, hey, can we work with this person for a sustained period of time from a personality standpoint? Then that's more of a like spidey sense around it, and I'm sure we struck out many times when it comes to this. But there is a compatibility component in construction and architecture that's important, I think, because there is inevitably things that will go wrong through the process, and you kind of want to be on the same team as folks that you think will be like-minded in addressing those challenging issues. So that's usually number one. Number two is, from a project standpoint, it always has to be highly lucrative. And what I mean by that is really on the development side of things. Like, we don't do a project unless there's a long-term lucrative component about it. And I'm not shameful to say that that's how most real estate developers think about the world, is that you have to engage in something that's going to make money, and ideally a significant amount of money, long-term, based off of the long-term requirements of real estate development, where you actually do a lot of work up front, not getting paid for it. And so that's always another tenet, like lucrative. The other is, we always want to engage in projects that have the possibility to create great design, for whatever that may be. So it's pretty easy early on in the project to understand what the kind of levers are from a push and pull standpoint, how you can move a building around, how you can shape a mass, like whatever it may be, to know if you might end up on a good design. Not that you will, but you want at least the possibility to. And especially being in a place like New York, there is a a lot of that sometimes, where the zoning envelope is so tight, you have to build up to it. There's a window to wall ratio that's a requirement, and there's an existing contextual condition that you can't really overcome. That's not so much the case. And so we want to make sure that we have the ability, at least the opportunity, to design something that we'll love, and knowing that we're going to spend 2 years doing that thing. So we always think of it through those like 3 tenets. And usually 2 or the 3 are okay, then we'll go for it. But it just depends.
Yeah, I think they're all very important. Especially, I also relate to the people aspect. You're going to work with them. You don't want to change teams in the middle. I did that for a couple of projects, and it was really a nightmare. So from the start, if you have trustworthy people on the team, that's like the biggest asset that you can get. So yeah, thanks. I think those are 3 great.
Yeah, I think it sort of for me goes back to what you said before about not aiming for 100% perfection. Good enough is sometimes good enough, because in a lot of things that we do, there are variables that we just have no control over. So whether it's the behavior of other people or the economic climate or policy that's affecting the place, we often have to kind of adjust. And I'm sure that you have to do that quite a lot with the work. Nevertheless, I'm really impressed, with how cerebral you are about your whole career path, but also how you approach each and every job. And I think that that's something that I'm influenced and inspired by, to aim for things that are worth it, aim for things that make us feel valuable and make us feel like we're making a difference. That also know that it is important to just get stuff done and keep moving forward. I think you demonstrate a really sort of nice balance between the aspirational and the practical. It's a good place to wrap up on, and I think this has been a really fascinating conversation just about how one not only enters into a design career, but actually designs their career themselves, which is sort of what you've been doing, trying to figure out the best solution for you to get to where you want to be. Thank you so much for that. I guess one thing we would want to ask, just if our audience wants to find more about you, Wiskup Architecture, or Neighbor, where can they find out?
Yeah, send us a note at either hello@itsneighbor.com or hello@wiskuparchitecture.com. Take a peek. Happy to engage in any folks that want to reach out. This is a challenging profession to navigate coming out of school. I just want to recognize that. And it's a challenging profession to navigate being 10 years in or 15 years in or 20 years in. And we don't really get enough, that's not really talked about enough, I think. We don't really get enough recognition around that as a profession because it's a historically underpaid and undervalued profession. And so we have to constantly think of creative career tactics in order to just, again, like I said, make ourselves happy, right? So I always welcome the conversation. It's very interesting to me. Again, nothing is sacred. No path is sacred. And so I love it when folks reach out to chat about things.
Wonderful. I hope people do reach out to you. And anyway, thank you, Evan, so much for spending your afternoon with us. It was really a remarkable conversation. Again, I personally learned a lot. And for those of you guys who are listening, if you haven't already, please follow, like, and subscribe on the Most Modern Podcast. Check out Neighbor and Wiskup Architecture in your free time too. And we'll be back on the next episode.